Operation Lumberjack, or the War of Survival, is both a pivotal moment in Wolver's history and a lesson in writing about villains and the craft of world building. This shall be a two-part series in which I talk about the nature of Operation Lumberjack from an objective yet secular perspective in Part 1, and a general piece of advice on how to write villains in Part 2. In this video, I hope you will note that the buildup is much more apparent than the actual war. So strap along for the ride and enjoy the show. The national symbol of Walcadia is the Tree of Life, a beacon of defiance against invaders. Its origins were born when early Walcadian noblemen planted trees in lands they claimed as their own. For wherever the tree was planted, it could never be chopped down. Even today, this has an impact on Walcadia, as the sign of the golden tree was emblazoned on Walcadia's flags and coat of arms. This tree is a neutral symbol, the symbol of the Walcadian nation without any politics attached, unlike later symbols representing the national ideology. At least, that's what is claimed. Now, what is a lumberjack? A lumberjack is someone who cuts down trees so they can be repurposed into something more useful. In short, the Pacific Atlantic Treaty Organization, a democratic coalition made up of Cascadia, Atlantica, and Ethiopiana, wished to cut down Walcadia's pride, empire, and authoritarianism so it could be repurposed into a vision for a more progressive future. In short, Walcadia's hostile monarchy is to be repurposed into a democratic state. Its national ideology changed from that of an arrogant tree to a refined piece of wood. The People's Kingdom of Walcadia, under the rule of the authoritative Emperor Frederick, presents a complex but fascinating case in global politics. Despite the criticisms often leveled against it by Pato nations, including notable figures such as President George Wallace of Cascadia, Walcadia's system demonstrates a commitment to progress and stability that merits a closer examination. Now, let's analyze the People's Kingdom of Walcadia with the Democratic Coalition. As you've no doubt seen the positive side of Walcadia, I'll put the video in the description if you haven't. It's time to see the external propaganda in its full force. Walcadia is a hybrid regime ruled by the authoritarian Emperor Frederick in order to bring progress while conforming to religious law. Although no one can doubt the immense improvement in living conditions within the People's Kingdom, Walcadia's refusal to conform to international standards has raised several alarms. I'll use the words of George Wallace, the Cascadian president, to show the grievances that Pato nations have with Walcadia. If you're a people's kingdom, why aren't you a democracy? If you're a symbol of progress, why cling to your outdated thorax faith? If you're a peaceful nation, why don't you conform to international standards? If you support treating people with dignity, why do you build labor camps? If you're building a federation of equals, then why are you fighting freedom fighters in the Philippines? Of course, there are reasons for this behavior. Democracy has never worked in Walcadia, and thorax faith has helped preserve the worship of God in a world filled with polytheists. Though Walcadia refused to sign international human rights agreements, it has still treated citizens with decency, only sending the worst of the worst to hard labor. Walcadia's transformation of its colonial empire into a federation where all nations within have equal autonomy has nothing to do with stopping the fight against cartels and terrorists. Atlantica, Ethiopiana, and Cascadia all have their separate grievances with Walcadia. Atlantica, known for its place in the Great Lakes and relatively modest nature, has a generally favorable view of the People's Kingdom despite ideological differences. Ethiopiana mostly despises Walcadia for its colonial empire, including the two corridors Walcadia has in Ethiopian territory. However, Cascadia's dispute is a bit different. In the Cascadian view, Narsland, once part of British Canada, now British Columbia and Yukon Territory, was sold legitimately to the British Empire by Walcadia. They argue that Walcadia's government reclaimed the land by force, even though the trade was fair and the land is better off under a democracy. Conversely, Walcadians contend that the British Empire unjustly acquired the land through a coerced deal, and they rightfully reclaimed it during World War I. They maintain that given there has been no rebellion since their takeover, their control aligns with the will of the people. Such a conflict gave way to extremism, which came with both the foundation of Cascadia as a nation and the alliance of Pato. Its goal? Combat imperialism and spread democratic values throughout the North American continent, and hopefully, the rest of the world. Although its mission was initially in direct conflict with Wolcadia, Pato tried to extend its hand to the People's Kingdom for a while, even offering membership into the alliance provided certain conditions were met. Wolcadia's rejection of this deal set a stage for conflict and a potential further backslide of democratic values throughout the world. This grew even worse when a group of Wolcadian extremists bombed a small plot of land on the other side of the Cascadian border known as Hethrin Farm. This farm was peaceful, its residents notable pro-Wolcadian activists, and yet Wolcadia's own nationalists and extremists destroyed the farm and raped its inhabitants. After a UN investigation was held, it was revealed that the Wolcadian government had ties to the extremists and could thus be held responsible for the war. The catch? None of those extremists were Wolcadian at all. They belonged to Cascadia's Environmental Protection Agency, a unit of war criminals disguising themselves as mere park rangers, merely pretending to be Wolcadians. The UN, which was supposed to be entirely neutral and impartial, was successfully bribed by Cascadian officials, seeking to ensure a quick condemnation of Wolcadia. And guess what? The world bought the investigation, adhering to Cascadia's side of the story unquestioningly. In a speech to the entire world, Cascadian President George Wallace condemned the Wolcadian government for its supposed involvement in the Hethrin Farm massacre, issuing an ultimatum designed to provoke a refusal while looking good on the world stage. These demands included the decolonization of Wolcadia's empire, including the transfer of the southern corridors to Ethiopiana and Narstland to Cascadia. The Wolcadian government was also demanded to adopt meaningful democratic reform and demilitarize, playing into the interests of Cascadia. In response, Emperor Frederick of Wolcadia explained his rationale for refusing these demands. First, he questioned the legitimacy of the UN investigation, mentioning that observers from Wolcadia or even neutral countries that had nothing to do with the dispute were forbidden. Second, he explained that decolonization, democratization, and demilitarization weren't in the interest of the Wolcadian government, as the People's Kingdom had tried such a path before, to great failure. He concluded the address by requesting George Wallace visit Wolcadia, mentioning that the Wolcadian people would be willing to greet him with open arms. However, that wasn't enough for the Cascadians. Tensions rose, threats were made, and condemnations from both sides shook the world with their increasing ferocity and malice, until finally, the war began. The day is March 1st, as a clear and wintry sky shines above a peaceful Wolcadian home alongside the Cascadian border. Jernasnacht, a prominent holiday also known as Wolcadian New Year, was being celebrated throughout the People's Kingdom. Although the tense diplomatic atmosphere encouraged the family to go elsewhere, Eshkreval, the kind yet stubborn grandfather, insisted that they stay at their homes and await the destruction. He knew of Wolcadia's victory in Canada way back during World War I, and he wasn't prepared to have his family abandon their homeland to their Anglo enemies. Thus, a grand table was set as his large family prepared to dine at the end of a long fast. Adunira, the mother, spends all of the previous day cooking for the family, while brothers Ohar and Alvor are getting everything set up. Just as sister Ivanka begins playing the piano and uncles Yohintor and Tavushik begin singing, a loud noise is heard, a blinding light is shown, and the entire house disintegrates within a second. Jernasnacht, what was meant to be a peaceful holiday, turned into an epitaph of the ruinous powers of war as Cascadian bombs fell on Wolcadian soil. This particular day of the attack was chosen meticulously by the Cascadian armed forces to belittle and taunt the Wolcadians. The goal was to break their spirit and force an early surrender. However, this attack was met with the opposite response, as Wolcadians proudly defended their homeland with everything they had. They knew their mountainous and forested terrain well, and even though the Cascadians to the north lived in a similar environment, Wolcadia's militias managed to cut them down with everything they got. Soon, Wolcadia unleashed an offensive into Atlantica, tearing apart their nation in half and requesting the Atlantican government to surrender. Although Atlantica's president, Richard Nixon, gladly signed the peace treaty, he was removed by a group of pro-Cascadian zealots who wished to continue the war and mission to spread democracy. This led to an Atlantican government being established that directly opposed the People's Kingdom of Walcatia and eventual mass propaganda throughout the world. With Walcatia continuing to make advances against Cascadia and Atlantica, the tide of the war turned when Ethnopiana, with Soviet support, initiated Battle Plan Clara, named after an old Ethnopianan hero. The brave soldiers of the Ethnopianan Air Force struck at Walcatia's defenses, crushing Walcatia's fighters whenever they could. These Ethnopianans expected to be liberated in the southern corridors, but were surprised when the northern lights they expected to see turned sour. The brave people of the southern corridors, resilient in their determination to remain Walcatian, turned these cities into walking traps. At first they were orderly armies, proudly carrying imperial banners in a show of force to intimidate the Ethnopianans. Then they became guerrillas, sneakily hiding in their cities to fight against their would-be liberators. Finally, these self-sacrificing Walcatians resorted to exactly that, self-sacrifice, as even small children threw stones, chairs, and tables at Ethnopianan soldiers. Instead of the day-long affair the Ethnopianans believed it would take, it took several months just to claim the cities. However, in the Ethnopianan mind, it was worth it. Walcatia's imperial claims over places such as Tartan, New Moscow, and Ostcliff were overthrown, and they could enjoy their frosty island in peace, at least until the newest operation. Following the complete domination of the Ethnopianan island, Ethnopiana's soldiers attempted to conquer Walcatia's Aleutian Isles and launch another land campaign into Alaska. Following this, the Ethnopianan Navy successfully dominated the Pacific, cutting off access between Walcatia and her colonies and allowing Cascadia to begin its full assault on Walcatian territory. Walcatia's considerable population and vast expanse rendered it nearly impregnable to invaders. Cascadian soldiers faced not just a densely populated landscape, but also a sophisticated defense strategy. Contrary to the propaganda claims of human wave assaults perpetuated by the Cascadian government, the reality was far more nuanced. Walcatian forces employed a strategic deception, leveraging the natural terrain and their numerical advantage to create the illusion of overwhelming waves of troops. At night, Walcatian soldiers, organized in squads of 8, executed precise covert strikes against Cascadian positions, resulting in significant casualties and disorientation. The dense forests, further fortified with strategically placed mines, complicated movement and made traditional military maneuvers almost impossible. This combination of guerrilla tactics and environmental hazards created a formidable defense, obscuring the true scale of Walcatia's military might and leaving Cascadian forces mired in confusion and attrition. Cascadia compensated for this by utilizing its technological advantage, leveraging advancements in weaponry, surveillance, and communication systems characteristic of the era. The deployment of cutting-edge equipment, such as night vision goggles, radio communications, and precision-guided munitions allowed Cascadian forces to partially mitigate the challenges posed by Walcatia's guerrilla tactics and rugged terrain. In addition, aerial reconnaissance and satellite imagery provided crucial intelligence, enabling Cascadian commanders to adapt their strategies and counter Walcatia's elusive and unconventional warfare techniques. The fusion of technological superiority with strategic innovation became a critical factor in the evolving dynamics of the conflict, shaping the outcomes of engagements and influencing the balance of power on the battlefield. However, the worst was yet to come, as Cascadia chose the path of inhumane atrocity to cement their advantage. First came the ricin bombings of the city of Arskad-Heturin, where the poison claimed the lives of 300,000 innocent civilians, with half succumbing immediately and 200 more left injured in its wake. In a callous escalation of brutality, Cascadian soldiers, under direct orders from the president, proceeded to ravage the countryside of Walcatia, deliberately drying up water sources and triggering a man-made drought that led to the agonizing deaths of 2,000 individuals due to severe thirst. In the conflict, Cascadia's most notorious unit for committing war crimes, was its Covert Environmental Protection Agency, EPA battalions. Operating in secrecy, these units were instrumental in perpetrating atrocities that were obfuscated under the guise of environmental initiatives. The EPA's actions, while publicly framed as efforts to preserve and protect natural resources, masked a darker reality. The true extent of their war crimes was concealed by a veil of environmental rhetoric, making it difficult for the international community to discern the full scale of their abuses. This deceptive strategy allowed Cascadia to carry out operations with minimal scrutiny, leveraging the ambiguous language of environmental protection to obscure the gravity of their actions and shield their illegal activities from widespread condemnation. One of such battalions, led by the ruthless Michael Rifton, accompanied by zealous priests, descended upon various small towns and rural estates in Walcadia with a sinister agenda. They coerced entire villages into converting to Christianity under the threat of unspeakable violence. Those who dared to resist faced horrific fates, including crucifixion or the grotesque punishment of being boiled alive in so-called holy water. Their remains callously fashioned into human rosaries as a macabre display of power and cruelty. Despite the gravity of these appalling atrocities, the international community turned a blind eye to the horrors unfolding in Walcatia. Instead, Cascadian forces were hailed as freedom fighters on a noble mission to liberate a purportedly oppressive regime. Walcatian accounts of Cascadian barbarism were dismissed as falsified propaganda, casting doubt on the authenticity of their harrowing tales and undermining the credibility of legitimate evidence presented to the world. The twisted narrative spun by international news networks painted a distorted picture, whitewashing the atrocities committed by Cascadia and perpetuating a narrative of justification and heroism where none existed. Not only did the Cascadian war criminals dismiss their atrocities as supposed conspiracy theories, they even reskinned Walcatian acts of humanitarian aid as acts of genocide. During this war, the Walcatian government, in an attempt to ensure the safety of children in occupied territories, ensured that civilian children would be adopted into Walcatian families. The ultimate goal was to keep them safe until they could be returned to their homes and families after the war. These acts, however flawed, were attempts of humanitarianism during a dark time, unlike Cascadian propaganda, which claimed that Walcatia was using Cascadian children as child labor. This was merely a part of the international media's special role in this war, making sure to condemn the People's Kingdom of Walcatia every time they got involved. Alongside these stories, images were shown of fanatical Thracian priests, Walcatian soldiers slowly losing momentum, and an oppressed Atlantican people firmly under Walcatian control. Every aspect of Walcatian culture was put on the chopping block. Every single frame of Walcatian life was condemned. As this staggering abuse continued, the Walcatian people felt isolated from the rest of the world. This was intentional, as any fair portrayal of Walcatian society would allow people and governments to think critically regarding the reasons behind the war. Despite the remarkable resilience and tactical ingenuity of the Walcatian forces, their unyielding struggle against the combined might of Cascadia, Atlantica, and Ethnopiana ultimately led to a momentous shift in the conflict. On April 5, 1979, Walcatia, having withstood prolonged pressure and maintaining its guerrilla resistance, negotiated a surrender that underscored its indomitable spirit and steadfast commitment to sovereignty. The terms of the surrender, brokered in Tartan, the former capital of the southern corridors, reflected a strategic compromise intended to preserve Walcatia's essential character while addressing the demands of its adversaries. Under the terms of the agreement, Walcatia secured significant assurances. It retained its state religion, national ideology, and existing governmental structure, affirming its core identity and values. Additionally, Walcatia was guaranteed the right to maintain its military within its core territories, ensuring its ability to defend itself. The nation also secured the right to trade with Cascadia and Ethnopiana for a minimum of 15 years, preserving its economic independence to some extent. However, the price of peace was substantial. Walcatia agreed to cede its disputed territories, including Narstland and its treaty cities, to their respective claimants. It also consented to relinquish its involvement in affairs beyond North America, dismantling its colonial commonwealths and severing external alliances. Furthermore, Wolkatia was obligated to pay war reparations to Cascadia and Ethiopiana, reflecting the financial burden of the protracted conflict. The Treaty of Tartan was a sad end to the war, as Cascadia declared a near-total victory with its atrocities unpunished. The death of Wolkatian Emperor Frederick, merely 2 days after peace was implemented, left a stark hole consuming the Wolkatian nation. The rest of the 70s and 80s was a bad decade for Wolkatia, with the nation unable to reset its economy and many of its civilians left in grueling poverty. Despite Cascadia's wartime atrocities, the actions taken after the war were benign. Though no formal apology was sent to Wolkatia, increasing supplies of aid were sent to Wolkatian citizens as it began to ally with other nations in the American continent. Its push for global prosperity and eventual victory in the Cold War against the Soviets led to a positive perception on the world stage. In 1994, the Cascadian government managed to push for some democratic reforms in Wolkatia, and in 2000, Cascadia managed to reunite the USA. I hope you enjoyed this video about Operation Lumberjack, for I surely enjoyed making it. Check out more videos on my channel, as well as channels I shall include in the description and comment section. Most of all, await Part 2 next month, where I will be describing how Operation Lumberjack shows a great example for villains in world building.